Dear students, dear colleagues, dear speakers, and your excellencies, but also dear friends and colleagues who are joining us online and from abroad, good afternoon or maybe good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to this roundtable discussing Catholic studies in Asia, prospects and challenges. My name is Michel Chambon. I'm a research fellow here at the Asia Research Institute, and I will facilitate our conversation. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome our three distinguished speakers: former Minister George Yeo, theologian Jonathan Tan, and NUS Professor Bruce Lockhart. Mr. Yeo, you are currently a visiting scholar at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore, and the founding patrons of its Asia Competitiveness Institute. For 23 years, you have served in the Singapore government. You have been Minister for Information and the Arts, Minister for Health, Minister for Trade and Industry, and Minister for Foreign Affairs. But you also have experience serving the administration of the Vatican and the Holy Father. In 2013-2014, you were a member of the Pontifical Commission for Reference on the Economic Administration Structure of the Holy See, and from February 2014 to July 2020, a member of the Vatican Council for the Economy. It is our pleasure to have you with us. Professor Tan, you are a theologian from Malaysia, and probably the only one from the region who is holding a chair in Catholic Studies in the US. You are the Archbishop Paul Hallinan Professor of Catholic Studies at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, USA. A native of Malaysia, Professor Tan, you came to Singapore and studied at St. Patrick's School and Victoria Junior College. You later graduated from NUS Law School and worked as a corporate attorney for 4 years before heading to the US for postgraduate studies, where you received a PhD in theology and culture from the Catholic University of America. We are extremely thankful to have you among us. Thank you for flying all the way from Ohio to join us in person. Professor Lockhart, you are an historian of Southeast Asia, teaching various history courses here at NUS. Your teaching and research focuses are mostly on the countries of mainland Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos. You have been interested in the topic of kings and monarchy, exploring how these Southeast Asian countries perceive and write their own history. As many of your students know, you are an engaged Christian. And despite your interest in monarchy, you are not a Catholic. Yet you are the professor teaching a very well-attended module on the history of Christianity here at NUS. It is our pleasure and honor to count you among our guests. So now, before we jump into our conversation on Catholic studies in Asia, please allow me to briefly introduce the background of this seminar. In fact, today's event is part of a broader effort and a long-term initiative to support research on the intersection between Asia and world Catholicism. 2 years ago, with Bernardo Brown, an anthropologist teaching at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and who was a research fellow here at ARI in the early 2010s, we established ISAC, the Initiative for the Study of Asian Catholics. This scholarly network seeks to support social scientific research on Asian Catholics in contemporary societies. In 2021, a number of academic colleagues joined us to explore ways to develop new collaborations, investigating the lived reality of Asian Catholics, whether they are Indian fishermen dealing with climate change and urbanization in South Asia, for instance, or American Vietnamese women dealing with transnational migration and ethnic identity in North America. Yesterday, October 1st, was a 2-year anniversary of this initiative for the study of Asian Catholics. In 2 years, Isaac, through the generous support of the Asia Research Institute, but also with the help of UCANU's International Christian University in Tokyo and now De La Salle University in the Philippines, the initiative has organized several workshops, conferences, in person and online, launched a variety of research collaboration on family, Mary in Asia, migrations, and others. We have also established podcast series and online roundtables to better promote scholarship on Asian Catholics beyond academic circles. I spare you the details of all these different projects and collaboration. It will be too long. Today, our seminar is part of this long-term effort to support dialogue and research on Asian Catholics and on the ways in which contemporary Asia intersects with the largest religious organizations of the world, the Catholic Church. We are here to listen and learn from our 3 distinguished speakers who have shared intellectual interest and expertise on Asian Catholics. What is the scope and realities of Catholic studies in Asia? How is Catholicism influencing Asia? But also, how are Asian people shaping world Catholicism? Are Catholic studies relevant to the understanding of Asian societies? To what extent Asian policymakers, journalists, and religious leaders need more academic resources to understand Asian Catholics and the global Catholic Church? This is hopefully some of the questions we will be able to explore together. In terms of format, our speakers will first share their insight and analysis on a series of questions related to Catholic studies in Asia. In the second time, we will welcome questions from the audience. For people here in the room, we will ask you to take a microphone, introduce yourself, and raise your question directly to our speakers. For the online audience, we invite you to submit your questions in advance to the online moderator, and she will help us to bring them to our speakers later. So without further ado, let me ask a first question, and maybe to you, Professor Tan, since you are holding a chair in Catholic studies in the US. What is this field of Catholic studies? Could you briefly introduce us to this notion of Catholic studies? What is that in America?
My name is Jonathan Tan, and I hold the endowed chair, the Helenen Professor of Catholic Studies at Case Western Reserve University. So let me say something about Catholic studies. This is something that first emerged in the United States. So what is Catholic studies? Catholic studies, the way I would define it, is an interdisciplinary academic field of study of the Catholic tradition in its rich heritage and diversity. So it is interdisciplinary, incorporates sociology, anthropology, philosophy, theology, literature, history, politics, economics. It's a field of study like Buddhist studies, Jewish studies, Islamic studies. Of course, now in the US, thanks to Catholic studies, now we have Anglican studies, Orthodox studies, even evangelical studies, and charismatic or renewal Christian studies. It's the newest field. Pentecostal studies is another name for that. But it all started with Catholic studies. So I will identify 3 phases or 3 trends. So the first phase, the first trend is in the aftermath, in the heady years after the end of the Second Vatican Council in the late 60s. For those of you who are Catholics in this room, you know that one of the last documents that came out of the third session was the pastoral constitution of the church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes. The thrust of Gaudium et Spes, this was the first time you see in the document that came from an ecumenical council, which is a gathering of bishops from all around the world to discuss and issue statements that will shape the direction of the Catholic Church. Gaudium et Spes talks about the engagement, the church's engagement with the modern world. So, so my chair, the Archbishop Hellenan Chair in Catholic Studies, is actually the oldest Catholic Studies chair in the United States, the first ever to be set up. So a group of Catholics, Cleveland area Catholics, Irish Catholics with lots of money, decided that, hey, Gaudium et Spes says something about engaging with the modern world. Up to this point in time, theology was only done in Catholic universities. So Case Western Reserve University is a secular, private university. It is not associated with any church or denomination. It's a private secular university like Stanford, or something to that effect. So what happened is they decided to say, let's set up an endowment. They approached Case Western Reserve University. We are going to give you this amount of money. We want to establish this chair in honor of Archbishop Paul Hellenan. So for those of you who are Catholic geeks, Archbishop Hellenan was the Archbishop of Atlanta. He was a Peritus or representative at Vatican II. He was involved, very much involved in the passage of Sacrosanctum Concilium, the constitution on the liturgy. He was in the forefront of promoting liturgical renewal in the United States. So, of course, Archbishop Hellenan was also an alum of Case Western Reserve. He has his PhD in American history from Case Western Reserve University. He was also the chaplain of the Newman Center. In the US, Newman Center is the Catholic chaplaincy. So in 1969, they approached the university, and then the university, okay, this is unique, because before the Hellenan chair is the second chair. The first chair was set up by the Jewish Federation in Jewish Studies. So the Hellenan chair. So in the 1970, the university accepted the donation and set up a chair. And so the first phase was Catholics deciding that to set up Catholic studies in secular or non-Catholic universities. So you have Catholic studies at Case Western, Catholic studies in places like University of Chicago at Illinois, in Protestant institutions like in Duke, Vanderbilt, and Emory, University of Cincinnati. So in non-Catholic institutions, you cannot set up Catholic theology as such because they're either public or private. So that was the first phase. The second phase or second trend came about, for those of you who are Catholics, during the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, with the apostolic constitution Ex Code Ecclesiae. Now, Ex Code Ecclesiae, from the heart of the church, issued by Pope John Paul II, sought to define, delineate, and to promote Catholic identity at Catholic universities. The problem in the United States was many Catholic universities theology departments were doing all kinds of stuff. So the second phase was now at Catholic universities in response to Ex Code Ecclesiae, the mandate from Rome that you have to have, from the Vatican, that you have to have a Catholic identity. So the easy way around was to set up Catholic studies programs and departments now at Catholic universities. First, it was Gaudium et Spes. Catholics engaged in private or public non-Catholic institutions like at my Case Western. So now you have Catholic studies programs at DePaul, Georgetown, Loyola Chicago, Jesuit universities, Notre Dame. Now they all have Catholic studies program in addition to the traditional theology. But Catholic studies is broader than theology. So Catholic studies will include history, literature, music, art, political science, philosophy. Still very much Eurocentric, European-centered. So that was the second phase. The third phase, or the third trend, this is what I'll label as the emergence of an interest in global or world Catholicism as a field of study. So now moving from Catholic as something European or Vatican-driven as Catholic has become global Catholicism or world Catholicism. So this is also in parallel in the United States with the rise of a new discipline called world Christianity. So for those of you who are Catholics, you may remember that the Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner, in his 1979 address at the Jesuit Western School of Theology, later on in an essay published as Towards a Fundamental Theological Interpretation of Vatican II in 1979, he talks about Vatican II marked the first official self-actualization of Catholicism as a world church. So Vatican II marked the transition of Catholic Church as just a European, North American project to now a global or world church. So Rahner spoke of the three theological eras. So the first was Jewish Christianity. The second era was Hellenistic or Greek. So it's a European church, and the Eastern Church in the East. So all the way from the end of Jewish Christianity all the way to the 20th century. And then after 1965, Rahner spoke of the birth of the world church or world Catholicism. So let me quote from his article. So this is Rahner's words. So I quote, either the church sees and recognizes these essential differences of other cultures for which she should become a world church, and with a Pauline boldness draws the necessary consequences from this recognition, or she remains a Western church, and so in the final analysis betrays the meaning of Vatican II, end quote. So here's something to think about. 2/3 of Catholics today come from what we call the majority or 2/3 world, sometimes global south. Africa, Asia, and Latin America are witnessing significant growth of Catholics. The number of Catholics in India alone went from under 2 million to 17 million and should reach 26 million by 2050. There are more baptisms in the Philippines than in France, Spain, Italy, and Poland combined. And this was in 2012. In Korea, Catholicism has grown by roughly 70% during the last decade, and to more than 5 million people, representing about 10% of the total Korean population. So this is what we mean by focusing now a shift in Catholic studies to focus on world or global Catholics. So one example I would always give to my students in America is when I ask them, so where do you think is the world's largest Catholic church? They'll say, oh, maybe in Europe, I thought parish church, or in America. I say, no, it's actually in Dubai. St. Mary's Church in Dubai, UAE. It's the largest Catholic parish church worldwide with 300,000 parishioners, 35 to 40 masses in 12 languages, over 80,000 hosts distributed weekly. And it's primarily driven by migrant labor in the Persian Gulf states. So the shift now in Catholic studies is to study not just in Europe and North America. So my chair, the reason I'm the first non-white, non-European person, now there's African American and Latinos, but I was the first, the Catholic, when my predecessor retired, the Department of Religious Studies at Case Western decided that they wanted to focus on global Catholicism. So they hired me because Asia is Asia and Africa are the two areas with the fastest growth. So I'm at the cutting edge of research. If you're familiar with my scholarship, I study Asia, Catholics in Asia. So my program is Case Western Catholic Studies is a shift to global Catholicism. Let me give you two other examples before I pass the mic on. So the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology is the Catholic Studies program at DePaul. It was established in 2008. This is one of the this is at DePaul, so it's a Catholic university, so the second phase. So among Catholic universities, they are the first to shift from Catholic studies focusing on Europe and North America. So in 2008, DePaul University set up this center. They shift the Catholic studies to world Catholicism and intercultural theology. So they wanted to build on Vatican II Gaudium et Spes, and to say that the center of Catholicism has shifted to the rest of the world. And the third example is the Michael C. McFarland Center at the College of the Holy Cross. It's a Jesuit liberal arts college. And so they have a Catholics and Cultures initiative. The Catholic Studies program at Holy Cross also shifted to Catholicism and culture. And so and I quote from them, they want to explore what Pope Francis refers to as dialects of a global church, focusing on lived Catholicism around the world. So they have a website and they have coursework that looks at Catholics in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So that is the third phase. I've given you two examples among Catholic universities that shift to that. And then for non-Catholic, it's my chair, so that focuses on this. So this is basically the lay of the land for Catholic studies. You have everything that look at Catholic studies in the traditional sense. The Europe and North America, all the way to global or world Catholicism, which I think is where the energy and the focus is now on, since 2/3 of the world's Catholics come from the majority world.
And yet we see that Catholic studies are really linked to the US history and to theology. So I would like to bring the conversation now to Asia. What, in this stage, we're in 2023, what can Catholic studies bring to the study of Asian societies, and what can, on the other way around, and maybe to you, Mr. Yeo, what can Asian societies bring to the field of Catholic studies? So the relationship between the two, Asia and the new emerging field from the US of Catholic studies.
Michel, I know very little about Catholic studies. And the reason why I'm interested is because I want to understand myself. Because being a cradle Catholic infuses in me a very strange culture and emotion. I can be attending Mass in South America, Japan, in Australia, in Europe, in India, in Vietnam. And I feel that I belong. The same liturgy, even if I don't understand the language. And the sacraments are the same, equally valid. And this universality is at a primal level. You feel it. I don't feel alien, even when there are no kneelers in Japan, or when in Vietnam, the men and women sit on different sides of the aisle. But regardless, I'm Catholic. I have a right to be there. No one can expel me, and I can receive the sacraments. I say, how is that? It's very strange. And I went to the Vatican. I was the only non-European in the original Council of Commission of 8, the only non-European. But I felt, yes, I too am a member. I too have a right. I too have a say. And I was there because Pope Francis wanted a Chinese. They were scouring around for a Chinese, and in the end, I lost the elections and was available. So they said, well, okay, you do it. And of course, they did. The nuncio there must have done some background checks on me. There was not a bigamist and so on. And in the Vatican, oftentimes one of the cardinals would say Mass for a small group of us on the council at 7 a.m. So we wait. It could be cold winter morning. We were waiting, huddling. And then punctually at 7, the doors would open and we stream in from Domus Santa Marta, where we enter. And then streaming in from the sacristy would be priests of different colors, usually with an altar boy. Some by himself, some with a little troop, others with a large procession, and saying masses in different corners of the basilica and the crypt, in different languages. Some said, some sung. And I could choose which I wanted to join, you know. I mean, if the cardinal were there, I'll join the cardinal. If not, we just look around and go, oh, okay. So one day I was there with Cardinal Krajewski from Poland. No English. He was trying to dismiss us, but we followed him all the way anyway. And so we attended a Polish mass. It's a very strange emotion. And think about it. It is the oldest organization in the world. And today we learn in, in management school, universities, the key is to follow the money, right? How control system, balance sheet, income statement, consolidation. But the Catholic Church has local finances, and the finances of the Vatican are the finances of the Vatican only. The Church has no claim on the properties or incomes of different dioceses, nor the bishop of parishes. And that gave to the Church historically a certain cellular robustness. You can destroy parts of it, but it doesn't affect the other parts, because the other parts are held by transcendental qualities, not by money. I've often reflected, yes, money is important. And when I was there, I was concerned about money. But yet the Church endured because it was not connected by money. It was not driven. So what gives it is continuity, if continuity is a goal. So as I grow older, I've decided to pick up Duolingo Latin, and trying to learn Latin declensions, which is so difficult for me. But anyway, I tried to memorize the credo. You see, so it says in the end, et unam sanctam catholicam et apostolicam ecclesia. One holy Catholic and apostolic church. I've come to the conclusion that being one is a struggle. Being holy is a struggle. Being Catholic is a struggle. Being apostolic is a struggle. And more, I understand what the Muslims mean by jihad. That jihad is a struggle within yourself. Oneness means monotheism, means we are brothers and sisters. But I don't like the person. He's done evil to me. He's killed my brother. How can I accept him as a brother? Ukrainians and Russians, are they one? Chinese and Americans, are they one? Indians and Pakistanis, are they one? Yes, an abstract level. So when Pope Francis said, no, we take a position against the death sentence. Because you cannot on the one hand be against abortion and on the other hand accept the death sentence. There must be a continuity, the sacredness of life. More importantly, hope that a person like Paul can change, even at the last hour. Holy is a daily struggle, right? For the church, of course, for the Pope, for the bishops, for all of us. But because we hold up an ideal and we do not normalize what is not holy, so it maintains a certain dynamic equilibrium. Catholic, the universal church, that I feel, wherever I am. But historically, of course, Catholics have also been famous for discrimination. And it is a struggle. So when you have suddenly coming to your parish, a priest coming from a third world country speaking an accent you can barely understand, Oh dear, you know. But okay, he's a Catholic priest, he's got holy hands, we could accept it. We require a certain intellectual override to say, look, okay, I accept him as a priest because this is what I believe. It is a struggle. And apostolic, well, okay, it's a succession, but it's constantly contested. I mean, China today, well, you know, it's still kind of a delicate concordat between Beijing and the Vatican. And in Vietnam, it's a bit more settled now. Hopefully, it paves the way for China. Maybe. Well, we'll see. If the spirit wants it, it will happen. We should work towards it, but we can't hold our breath because there is a divine plan which we don't understand. But in the end, it comes down to the celebration of mysteries. So in that famous exchange of letters in the Bologna newspaper between Umberto Eco, who is a self-avowed atheist. Self-avowed atheists don't exist. If you are self-avowed atheist, you're actually very religious. See? So it's actually a debate between belief and non-belief. And Cardinal Martini, the Jesuit bishop of Milan. And one famous line, a repose from Martini, he said, our mission is not to explain everything. It is to celebrate mysteries. Mysteries. Why are we here? Why is the universe so amazing? Virgin birth, is that possible? And even in the Creed, when he says on the third day he rose again, he says secundum scripturas. In other words, this is belief. You cannot explain it. And so many things in the church and in life which we cannot believe. Yet at the same time, as a Catholic, we learn that God is love, right? So both Benedict and Francis, when they were asked, why did God create the universe? Out of love. When I first read it, I thought, wait a minute. I just watched a movie, Oppenheimer, yesterday. You know? Yeah, Princeton physicists say, why did God create the universe? Love? No, it was all these formulas, quantum mechanics, relativity. But he created it out of love. There's a mystery. But counterposed to it is John, God is logos. The word, reason, coding. But love. So somehow in this mix, you create a universal church which has endured more than any other organization. It deserves study. When I was at Montserrat in May, so the number 3 there, I can't remember his name, there's a name for it. Anyway, he explained the Benedictine monastic rules. So you vote. You see there are 4 tables. 4 tables. One, you eat around the table. Then you're at church around the divine table. Then you have a political table where they sit, one man, one vote, and then they vote for the abbot, but for life. So once you vote for him, it's absolute. Of course, he can be impeached, but by other monasteries coming in to intervene. But if the Pope misbehaves, then we have a problem, right? But luckily, he's mortal. So in the end, the problem will resolve itself. So even when the Pope was captured in Avignon, the French cardinals said, no, we must go back to Rome. We have to go back to Rome because there's something in them, transcendental, beyond politics, beyond family, which stirs them, in the end, to come back to what is right. All this is fascinating. And as a Catholic, I watch all this in wonderment. You know, why am I a Catholic? Why am I so proud to be a Catholic? Belonging to this amazing, incredible, but fallen organization, but which still endures. And that's why I have this great fascination with what you're trying to do, Michel.
But I'm going to bring it back to Asia. and I'm going to throw our dear colleague under the bus and ask him, okay, so from an Asian perspective, and especially from a perspective of Southeast Asian history, why should we engage with Catholic study?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm very pleased to be here. As Michel mentioned, I'm the token minority. I'm actually an elder, a lay leader in a Presbyterian church. But I have for quite close emotional connections to Catholicism since I was a boy. And actually, for me, Catholicism also has an Asian face because my closest friends were Vietnamese refugees and they were Catholic, and they had a Catholic mass in Vietnamese once a month. So I actually learned the mass in Vietnamese before I ever learned it in English. But I teach, as Michel mentioned, I teach, my field of research is generally speaking not religion, but I am working now on the implantation of the French in Southeast Asia in the 19th century. And of course, if you're looking at that topic, you have to look at the missionaries along the way. But then when I teach my undergraduate history of Christianity, which is basically 2,000 years in one semester, one of my main goals, both there and in my church, is to help fellow Protestants understand more about Catholicism. And I think generally I'm successful with that. I thought I would just share a little bit about how we as historians of Southeast Asia study Catholicism. And of course, I have never met a Southeast Asianist who calls themselves a specialist in Catholic studies, but we're probably getting there. And so broadly speaking, let's see, from a historical point of view, and both historians and anthropologists are probably the two groups of people that study Catholicism in Southeast Asia most often. The two basic groups that we're interested in are, of course, the missionaries and then the converts or the native community. When we look at missionaries, one of the things that I try very hard to get my students to understand is the diversity of the missionary experience in Southeast Asia. Many of you are familiar with the phrase that the Bible follows the flag, and so the assumption is always that Catholicism came into the region, as it did in many other places, with conquest. And so I point out that in the Philippines, that is true, but that is certainly not true in the case of Vietnam. That Vietnam, of course, had Catholics for hundreds of years before the French ever colonized Vietnam. And then the French colonial regime was generally quite hostile to the missionaries. So most Vietnamese Catholics' ancestors probably converted before colonialism. So already you have a very, very strong diversity between the Philippines and the Vietnamese, which are the two countries in Southeast Asia, which have been historically most strongly marked by Catholicism. And so on the one hand, when we study missionaries in Southeast Asian history, we have to look at the diversity of relationships between the missionaries and the regimes that they were there under, also recognizing that in many cases, the missionaries, again, the Philippines would be the big exception, but for the rest of Southeast Asia, the missionaries were not really particularly imperialist until the 19th century, when they began pushing more strongly for their national interest. So that's the first aspect of missions that we look at, is simply to understand the diverse relations that they had with colonial regimes. The second, and this is something that's relatively recent, is looking at missionaries as anthropologists or observers or as scholars. One of the big trends in the historical study of missionaries in the last few years is that, and this is true globally, until maybe 2 decades ago, you were either a Christian historian writing a rah-rah history about missionaries, or you were a secular historian writing very, very critical history about the missionaries, and there was very little meeting of the minds. In the last 2 decades or so, there have been a group of scholars, some Protestant, some Catholic, some, I think, secular-minded, that are really trying to understand the missionaries on their own terms, understand what they thought they were doing in the areas that they were serving, and also analyze how they looked at the people around them. Because in many cases, the first Europeans that really came and lived in Southeast Asia and wrote about Southeast Asia were missionaries. And of course, it was for hundreds of years, it was the Catholics. Because the Protestants, as I tell my students, we play catch up. Protestant missionaries didn't really arrive until around 1800, and the Catholics had been there for quite a long time before that. So that's looking at the missionaries. If we focus on the communities, the Catholic communities that they created, then there are several things that we can study. Simply studying their lives and studying their the way that they lived their Catholicism, which is, I believe, what Michel does, particularly in the present time. But now, especially in terms of Vietnam, there are a group of scholars that have been looking at, they've learned the particular language that was used to write Catholic tracts and Catholic scriptures in Vietnam in the 16th, 17th century, 18th century, and they are studying those materials to understand the life of the Catholic communities in that time. And this has also been done to a certain extent in the Philippines. So the first thing to look at is the lives of the converts. The second is to look at the process that we can call acculturation or localization, how Catholic culture did, or how Catholic religion, Catholic doctrine did or did not blend in with local culture in Southeast Asia. And I think in Philippines, it was probably a bit stronger in the direction of really mixing together and localizing. In Vietnam, perhaps a bit less. But then the third thing that we would look at is the role, the situation of Southeast Asian Catholics vis-a-vis the nationalist movements in their country. If you study the history of the Philippines, anti-colonial, anti-Spanish nationalism first shows up within the church, and which is very logical, both because all Filipinos were Catholic and because the Catholic Church in the Philippines was one of the places that because the Spanish friars and the other clergy largely kept Filipinos from having much power in the hierarchy, therefore the church became a key focus of Filipino nationalism. But in the Philippines, the Filipinos were the majority. Everywhere else, they're in minorities, and so this is the other side of the picture. So, for example, in Vietnam, what happens to Vietnamese Catholics when the communists are staging a revolution? And how do they negotiate their kind of dual identity as Vietnamese and as nationalists? And this is something that several scholars, particularly in France, have looked at. Similarly, you have a country like Indonesia, where you had several Catholic communities scattered across Indonesia. They had been very loyal to the Dutch. They served as particularly as troops in the Dutch army. So then what happens to them when the Indonesian Revolution comes along? So the relationship between Catholicism, Catholic identity as both majority and a minority, and nationalism is also something that is very important. So all of these things are underway. And of course, anthropologists, generally speaking, are interested in either how particular groups practice their Catholicism now that the missionaries are gone, or in how they relate to other groups around them who are not Catholic. And so, as I mentioned, these are probably the two main disciplines. Of course, you do have sociologists looking at the role of Catholics in society. But I think if we want to understand the majority in the Philippines or the Catholic minorities in these other countries, we absolutely have to have a foundation looking at them as Catholics in their own right, with a good understanding of what they believe and how they came to be there.
Thank you. Well, before I open the floor for questions from the audience, allow me to bring back the topic of conversation and ask you, from your perspective, what could be the most important or stimulating research of topics when it comes to Asian Catholics, Catholic studies in Asia? This kind of conversation, we heard things in humanities, I will say, philosophy, economy, we heard things on nationalism, for instance, as a topic of research, theology. So which kind of research direction do you see as something important for Asia, for Asian societies and Catholic studies at large? And at the same time, which kind of challenge do you see for this kind of research? For instance, I'm impressed by how all of you we saw the linguistic dilemma coming back over and over. So in Asia, we have so many different national languages that are very different from each other. And unlike in Latin America, for instance, or North America, we don't have a common language for academic platforms to engage with each other beyond national boundaries. So that's this diversity of language is both a blessing and a challenge. So that's just an example from my side.
And you have to add Latin to the mix if you want to do it historically.
Because somebody here can talk about the difficulty of learning Latin. From your perspective, which kind of research direction you will see as important, each of you, and which kind of challenge should be acknowledge and consider in this rise of Catholic studies in Asia?
Are we going to talk later about Catholic studies versus Christian studies? Okay. Yeah, one of the questions that we were given to think about was the relationship between Catholic studies and broader Christian studies. And I think this is very important because, at least within the field of Southeast Asia, generally speaking, Catholics and Protestants are studied as two separate groups. And now this is partly because, particularly if you study missionaries, there are not many examples in Southeast Asia of people, ethnic groups, where some became Catholic and some became Protestant. Singaporean Chinese would be the main example, and then Vietnamese historically. But generally speaking, Catholic missionaries are studied separate from Protestant missionaries, and Catholic communities are studied separately from Protestant communities. My impression is much of the work I see, at least on Indian Christianity, is very similar. So it would be very useful, I think, to bring them together, to do comparative studies of, let's say, of Catholic missionaries and Protestant missionaries. So, for example, a very basic issue like how willing are you to train local clergy? How willing are you to have native priests and native pastors? I should mention, incidentally, that some people find the word native objectionable for reasons that are not clear to me. So they replace it, at least in American academia, they replace it with the French word indigène, which, as Michel can confirm, means exactly the same thing as native. It is used in exactly the same way as the word native. So I tell my students indigène sounds better because it's French, but I will stick with since I'm more or less bilingual, I know that indigène and native are the same thing. So I'll stick with native. Anyway, so the question for how willing were missionaries to train local clergy, and what kinds of roles did they have? This is a tremendously important question for the history of Asian Catholicism, and it's also an important question for the history of Asian Protestantism. So they could be put together very well. The other interesting thing would perhaps be the situation of a minority Christian community within a vis-a-vis a larger Christian community. So, for example, in colonial Indochina, there were almost no Protestant missionaries because the church pressured the colonial government to keep out the Protestant missionaries. I saw this very clearly in archival documents when I was doing my thesis research. 1954, the French leave. You have a pro-American South Vietnamese government, and American missionaries come in. So the relationship between, let's say, if you were Protestant missionaries under a Catholic regime, or if you were Catholic missionaries under a Protestant regime, would also be very interesting. A few years ago, I had a Catholic honor student who wrote his thesis on the early history of the French Catholic missionaries, the Mission Étrangère de Paris, which were the main Catholic missionaries in Singapore in the earlier decades. And I think he wanted to see whether there were any conflicts between the French Catholic missionaries and the British predominantly Anglican regime. And I think he was sort of hoping to maybe find some oppression by the evil Anglicans against the Catholics. But no, the Catholics didn't have to worry about the Anglicans. They spent all their time fighting with each other. There were tremendous arguments between the missionaries in Malacca, in Penang, and in Singapore, all French, all the same mission organization. The British Anglican government, no problem at all. So these sorts of things, these kinds of relations between missionaries and regimes of different Christian persuasions, I think are also useful. So we really need to see a wider and more comparative studies. And I think Catholic studies certainly is a subset of broader Christian studies, but we could have effective Christian studies that are looking at both.
Okay. I will make a plug for the fact that the Catholics are very diverse and pluralistic. What Professor Lockhart has mentioned is you have a padrado and a propaganda fide. You have the Goan schism in the 19th century when Portugal fought with Vatican. Many Catholics are not even aware of their own heritage and history. The reason why you have St. Joseph's Church as a Portuguese mission that lasted until Portugal signed an agreement where jurisdiction was transferred from the Archbishop of Macau to the Archbishop of Singapore. How many Singaporeans know that? I think 1980. No, it was a very late, so it lasted only that long because there were overlapping jurisdiction. Malacca, the propaganda fide could never get along with the padrado, and that happened in India too. The jurisdictions are divided. So when you talk about Latin Catholics, there's not a single Latin Catholics. Are you the descendant from the Goan Church, the Mangalore Church, the propaganda fide church that evangelized South India? Then of course there's the Keralites, the Siro-Malabars, the Siro-Malankaras. So I will still make a plug, and this is in North America. The reason why you have Anglican studies, Orthodox studies, evangelical, Catholic studies is because it's very good to do the comparative, but you can also do the comparative work within Catholicism. How many Singaporean Catholics know that there were overlapping Catholic jurisdiction in Singapore where Portugal and Vatican couldn't get along? So depending on who sent you, you are answerable. The reason why, if you go to St. Peter and Paul Church, how many of you saw the sign that says Napoleon III donated X amount of money? You know the sign? How many of you know about the French Catholic Protectorate, where the French government funded Catholic missions in China and East Asia? So if you're part of the French Catholic Protectorate, there was also jurisdiction issues. How many of you created Catholics know about this intra-Catholic dispute? Now, I have to say, because my PhD work is actually in mission studies. So there's something I share interest with you. And it's so fascinating to study all this rivalry just among the Catholics, so that there's less of a conflict with the British colonial administration who couldn't care less. So I hope this gives rise to an interest why we need Catholic studies in the historical sense, in the cultural sense, sociological, anthropological, because I think there's so much to learn about Catholicism and beyond theology. Let me tell you, in history, in sociology, in culture, the fact that Vatican, most people associate vernacular with Vatican II, Sacrosanctum Concilium, but Asian missionaries have been petitioning for the use of vernacular. So one of my research study was studying the propaganda fide archives, where I uncovered how from 19th to 20th century, how propaganda fide granted permission to Indonesians and Thais and Vietnamese and Chinese Catholics to be able to use vernacular in certain parts. So these are very, very fascinating things. And of course, when we talk about Catholics, one of the things I point out to people is we don't assume that Catholics are all local born. You go to Hong Kong, most Catholics are actually not Hong Kong Catholics, but migrants. You go to Japan, you walk into a Catholic church, there are more non-Japanese Catholics than Japanese Catholics. Singapore, because 1/3 of Singapore residents are migrants, only 2/3 are local born. So you have when you talk about Catholics, it's not just Singaporean born Catholics, Filipino Catholics, Indian Catholics, Catholics from all around the world. And of course, because I worked with Filipino Catholics before I went to the US or study, and there was always tension between Filipino Catholics and the Archdiocese, in the sense that, we want Mass in Tagalog. Just because we can speak English doesn't mean, we don't want a Tagalog Mass. So Korean Catholics and getting chaplains from Manila or Korea to come here has been a challenge. And for those of you who work with migrant Catholics here, so migration, history, sociology, anthropology. There's just so much to study about Catholics beyond just theology, because it is not theology that makes us Catholics. We are incarnated and flesh human. We bring our cultures, we bring our traditions, we bring all these things. This is what makes us universal.
It's God a foreigner. I mean, so it's got European. Is Jesus European? Is Mary European? I think that's the key question about localization of the church, without which it cannot be universal and Catholic. Pope Francis has long reflected that in Mother Mary's hundreds of apparitions around the world, she left her image only once, and that was in Guadalupe. And that image was of herself as a mestiza. As a mestiza. So when the Pope went to see Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, he said, God is Rohingya. God is Chinese. God is Hokkien. But today, in China, in Vietnam, God is seen as a foreigner. So Cortés was able to overcome Montezuma and the Aztecs because they believed that their God would come and be white from outside. Then the conquest is complete. So during the colonial period, God was European, and Europeans dominated. So naturally, their God should dominate. But when they had no political power, the Jesuits, when they went to China in the 16th century, in their catechisms, they presented Jesus, Mary, Joseph, the apostles as Chinese. As Chinese. And only then could they really be accepted. So if you look at Buddhism, it took centuries for Buddhism to be fully digested, to become Chinese. Of course, there are bodhisattvas and arhats who big noses and so on, who are Indian. And the Chinese, yeah, we know they're Indian, like Tao Mo and so on. But Buddha, Guang Yin, they're Chinese. So in Vietnam, they're Vietnamese. In Japan, they're Japanese. They're East Asian anyway. In India, of course, in South India, because Thomas came very early, right? And the only Asian missionary among the apostles. So Christianity in South India is very indigenous. But Christianity in Asia, it would take a long time before it becomes indigenous. It will need to become so. And to go back to the catechisms of the 16th, 17th century, before missionaries had behind them the backing of guns and cannons. And this is what China means when it says the church must be sinicized. They don't mean it in the sense of taking over the church, but that it is emotional and spiritual underpinnings. When we see God face to face, is he a foreigner? Or am I a reflection of him? And if I'm a reflection of him, then we must look more or less the same. We are the same color and the same race. Otherwise, the God that we imagine is an ethereal God. But we are mortal. We need a physical representation. So this process of indigenization takes place to varying degrees all over Asia. And I think it's an important subject of study. And perhaps it's useful to go back to what the missionaries did when they had no political power behind them to force through a point of view.
Thank you. I see time flying, so I think it's time to open the floor for questions from the room. I see one hand. So you need to find a microphone. You should have a few. Maybe we can share from here. And for the online audience, you can also type in your questions through the chat box. You will be called later.
Hi, thank you so much, Michelle, and to our guest speakers. I'm X. I'm from the Asian Migration Cluster here in ARI. I'm very interested about many information that you provided. It's very enlightening. My question is, I'm coming from, I'm actually a policy scientist, but I'm studying nurse migration. And you mentioned about migration studies earlier on in the disciplinarity of Catholic studies. My question is, how are you going to encourage and approach interdisciplinarity in terms of Catholic studies? I rarely see how do you call that studies regarding, like for example, in Singapore and comparatively, how the French nuns started nursing in Singapore, and has been carried on from one generation to another. So when you go actually to nursing, in hospitals, the nursing managers are called sisters. It's very, very Catholic. In the Philippines, also, for example, where I came from, I'm actually educated from the Pontifical University in the Philippines. You see also different Catholic orders thrive in terms of higher education. They competed, different universities offering different kinds of programs, and how also the Philippines already as a destination countries for training Catholic and even other Protestant missionaries. So this is my question about how are you going to encourage interdisciplinarity in terms of Catholic studies in engaging, promoting Catholic studies beyond, as you have mentioned, theology. Thank you.
In the United States, Catholic studies is usually interdisciplinary in the sense that it is not housed in the theology department. It has its own department, and you have professors that are appointed who are historians, social scientists, literature, philosophy. So in the United States, there's a deliberate, intentional attempt, both at Catholic universities and also at secular private universities and non-Catholic universities, not to house it in the theology departments. So in the sense that Catholic studies is seen within the subfield of religious studies, and religious studies is interdisciplinary because in the United States, in the US system, we make a distinction between a field of study and a discipline. So Buddhist studies is a field of study. You can study Buddhist study through various disciplines: textual studies, historical studies, sociological, anthropological, hermeneutics. They're the same thing. Ideally, a Catholic studies program, you should draw upon literature, music, art history, philosophy, literature, and cultural studies. And I also say with the increasing challenges of the world, ethics, business, law. So in many Catholic universities, law faculties are also involved in that. So if there's a Catholic studies program in Singapore, I hope it'll be interdisciplinary, that drawing from it's a field of study. It's not a discipline. Theology is a discipline. Philosophy is a discipline. Buddhist studies, Catholic studies, these are area studies, field of studies. So I hope that distinction is understood, because sometimes even people in academia are not, they go back and forth uncritically between a discipline and an area or field.
Okay, yes, please.
Sorry, can I hear me? Okay, very good. My name is Andrew Chan, classmate of Jonathan Tan in law school, back here in the NUS many years ago. The very, if you like, brochure itself, which actually came out, starts at paragraph 1 in terms of, Catholicism being, if you like, the largest grouping, or at least like organization, 1.3 billion people. Mr. Yeo's point, essentially, it survives and there's actually a purpose. So obviously there's something this organization, in his words, worth studying. Professor Tan makes the point that in the United States, they have actually developed studies because of funds and what have you, but that's driven by funds, that's driven by people actually wanting to do it. And Professor Bruce speaks in terms of, we have studied this from a perspective of history, anthropology, etc. But the heart of the question, which this brochure actually asks, is in paragraph 2. And that's what I'm going to target my question on. And I read paragraph 2. It says, yet scholarly interest and research programs about world Catholicism remains rather limited. And then it goes on to read, while many factors explain this situation, secular biasness continue to affect the way in which religion and Catholicism especially is integrated in research and analyzes the contemporary society. So number one, this second paragraph recognizes that works in terms of Catholic studies, the interest is actually limited. Then it says that it's because of secular biasness. I mean, it raises the point, it doesn't give a solution. So the heart of the matter, because we're looking at prospects and challenges, my question is really this. I mean, Matteo Ricci, when he went to China, he integrated, he looked at, what it was in China, he adapted, right? The point about indigenization, do you view what you call Christ as Chinese? In fact, it's everything, all right? Paul speaks in terms of apostle politics and being a Jew to the Jew, the Gentiles unto the Gentiles. So the point is really this. I mean, if these are the secular biases and what have you, in the disciplines of history, sociology, and what have you, why don't look at those things which are important? Because there's a purpose behind those particular learnings, the secular learnings, which add value. Why can't we integrate some of these particular concepts, make what you call Catholic studies more relevant, integrate it into Asia? In other words, why view this as, maybe the reason why there's not so interest? How can we integrate, so if you like, secular learning? Because if you talk about economics, you talk about law and what have you, the Christian faith, the Catholic faith, there's a lot of those to explain those things. Why can't we bring all of those together and enhance the learning and academic teachings in terms of Catholic studies? So my question is really this. One, why is there lack of interest? Why can't we bring some secular concepts, integrate them, and generate and increase more interest for Catholic studies?
Well, maybe I don't feel comfortable talking on behalf of Catholic studies because it's not my field. But if I talk from, let's say, the perspective of NUS, okay, of let's say a Singaporean university, because I've been here for 25 years. I think there are a certain number of people who would like eventually to see a religious studies major at NUS. Right now, in this faculty, Arts and Social Sciences, we have what we call an multidisciplinary minor in religious studies, and a lot of students are interested in it. And certainly, if you take a typical cohort at NUS and any faculty, there is a much higher percentage of students who are followers of different religions than there would be at any Western university. So I think that the interest is there. So if we are thinking, particularly from the point of view of the academic curriculum, and there's already quite a lot of research going on, a lot of research here that's looking at Catholic studies and various aspects of religion. The issue is sort of getting it also more widely accepted into curricula. The problem there is that while there are a number of people at NUS who are interested in teaching about religion, if we were to try to get it into a major, we would have to go over to a certain tower on Buena Vista and get their permission and to set it up as a major. And it took about 5 years to get permission for an anthropology major. So I think we're going to have a religious studies major anytime soon, but I think it's a possibility and eventually, and it would be a very good way to do it here.
I think to answer Andrew's question, that's precisely what Catholic studies in the United States has been all about, drawing upon all these disciplines, because for the longest time, we just assume that when we look at Catholics or Anglicans or Orthodox Evangelical, it was always focused in theology. It was very insular. It was like nothing to, it was insular, using the lingo and the jargon internally. It's like a silo, a gated community that you study theology in seminaries or divinity schools. You didn't have all these area studies beyond. So what Catholic studies have done, so like for example, Loyola Chicago Catholic Studies, they had one recent conference of Catholic Studies was looking at religious freedom, co-sponsored between Catholic Studies, Law, and Religious Studies Department. You and I being lawyers by training, we are fascinated. So this is what we mean, that Catholic Studies, Christian Studies, Evangelical, Anglican Studies is not just simply theology or even history. It's about law. When you look at least in the United States, so question of religious freedom, where lawyers and historians and anthropologists, sociologists, and theologians and philosophers and ethicists sit down and have a conversation about that. I hope that NUS, being the premier university in Asia, at least by all those times, whatever ranking, has a space for that. Because you have Catholic studies at CUHK, the Chinese University of Hong Kong has Catholic studies. You have Catholic studies, you know, they are emerging, even in Hong Kong or in Ateneo also has a small Catholic studies thing. So if all these other places have Catholic studies, why not NUS? It's like as an like allergic reaction because Catholic studies is not just talking about religion as an ideology or theology. It's an important conversation that lawyers, ethicists, what about AI that is coming out? Does Catholic ethics, Protestant ethics, can they be part of the conversation about, say, AI, not just some secular philosophical ideals? So this is what we mean that perhaps there could be space at a university like this for this conversation to take place. That it's not just about theology or religious doctrines, but it's an honest intellectual conversation.
I hope Catholic studies are not just for academic interest, for the publication of papers, and for the attainment of awards and citations. But I hope the Catholic studies can uplift us, and not just Catholics. I hope for Singapore, we can begin from the particular to the general, which means we have a significant Catholic community in Singapore, which arrived almost at the same time with Stanford Raffles, and how it meets Singapore, together with other religions, which are also as deserving of study, and how we have been enriched, empowered, uplifted by it. So Jonathan talked about St. Joseph PM Church. We call it PM because it was Portuguese Mission Church. I was close to the Eurasian community, which is why I represented them in cabinet for many years. And it was mostly through the Our Lady of Fatima Block Rosary movement, because that was Portuguese. And we were praying for Salazar and Cayetano. Today, when I say that to my Portuguese friends, they laugh at me. You pray for those dictators? I said, yes. Because that was part of the Portuguese Mission Church. It was part of the Portuguese Empire. But it's an essential part of the Eurasian community in Singapore. Because for many of them, they grew up with this, and it's in their blood. And the core of the Eurasian community is still Portuguese. So it's taken over by the Opus Dei because the bishop decided that it's a city church. The Carmelite friars have St. Peter and Paul. We gave St. Joseph Church to Opus Dei. It's got beautiful architecture. But I say, please do not give up the Fatima procession on the 13th of every month. Because that's precious. It's a very important part of Catholic life. I went on that church 13th of every month when I was a kid. I said, don't lose that and continue to be a reference point for Eurasians in Singapore. You hold them together. If you take, say, the Aokang Teochew community, without the Aokang Teochews, there's almost no Catholic church in Singapore. Bishops, nuns, priests, how did they become Catholic? Many were Catholic before they came. And that corridor supplied fish, pork, vegetables from northeast Singapore to the city, the Aokang corridor, with all the milestones. And from Nativity Church, it became St. Anne, St. Joseph, and other churches. It's a very precious, essential part of Catholicism. Of course, it was the MEP. So many of the MEP priests studied Teochew and Hakka and the dialects. And when China expelled them, when the church took a position on the Korean War, So they came over here and they spoke in dialects. My mother did all her catechism in Teochew. I wish I learned the Teochew prayers. So I hope Catholic studies, firstly, respect where we are located, which is begin with the particular, with the lives of Singaporeans, and how, when they reflect upon this, they feel, oh, yes, we are part of a proud tradition. We grew, we helped others, we sustained, we became more abundant. And then from there, from the particular, you can become more abstract and talk about other societies. But please, in your studies, do not neglect the particular, because it is the particular which in the end gives justification to all that we do.
Can you hear me? Okay, my name is Christopher, and I'm here as an independent participant. So, can anyone on the panel kind of like, in a way, explain? So right now, what is the status of Catholic studies in Asia? You know, we've heard that the Philippines has some Catholic studies. What is the status? What subjects are they studying, and how much more can they go? You know, Hong Kong as well. In Singapore, you know, the ISAC has been around for 2 years. So what kind of direction can ISAC take in terms of, you know, building up a Catholic studies program in Singapore? I'd like to know about that. What about in, say, for example, in Indonesia, Japan, Vietnam, Thailand, and Taiwan? Do they have a Catholic studies program in the universities? If so, what are their Catholic studies program like? I mean, I really like to know about that, because when I was in the university decades ago, there was no such thing as a Catholic studies program, and I'm quite interested to know. So what are other countries doing, and what can Singapore do to promote Catholic studies? If anyone can explain that.
Maybe answers from the floor too.
Well, I mean, so Catholic studies is still pretty new in Asia. I mean, to answer your point. So Catholic studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong is a recent development. At Ateneo, it's still a recent development. There aren't really Catholic studies in India or Indonesia the way we understand it in North America, but we do have religion department. We do have Catholic universities in Indonesia, for example, that have been able to study Catholics within the framework of a religious studies major as such. So Catholic studies, I think, is this interest that is driven by the fact that is raised by even Mr. Yeo and Professor Lockhart, that Catholicism is so fascinating. It's just as an interesting area to try to understand and appreciate as much as Islamic studies, Jewish studies, Buddhist studies, because it has transformed the world in so many ways. So what can we do in Singapore? You know, there is no religious studies program at NUS. That's true. The old NANTA, before it was abolished, whatever, had a small comparative religion philosophy, whatever you want to call it. They mainly explore Chinese religions, but it could have the foundation. In other words, the study of religion is not alien in the Singapore context. If NANTA could have survived, that could have developed in a different way. But of course, one of the importance of studying history, as Professor Lockhart, is to understand what were the paths not taken. NANTA was shut down, so that was the end of one conversation. But that does not mean that we should stop exploring the possibilities. Catholics have contributed. So it's not just the other thing about Catholic studies is not just thinking in terms of what mission history or what the cultures have contributed to Catholicism. Wok Mu, the Vietnamese romanization of the Vietnamese language, basically how the missionaries, Alexander the Rhodes, for example, translated Bible and the Catechism and stuff. So it was a language. If you study like the emergence of Hangul over Hancha in Korean, Hangul was also driven by Catholic missionaries in Korea because the Catholic mission text. So what you have is Catholicism is like Andrew, the thing I have in common with Andrew, the idea of we are the salt of the earth, the light of the world, the yeast that leaven the bread. So what has Christianity generally, and Catholics and Protestants in particular, have done to transform society so that it's not just, we don't think just in terms of the number of conversions. We think in terms of what society has changed because Hangul, Wokmu, we have the idea of like Filipino sisters, little things that sort of the earth, like we have transformed. Those things are worth studying. Most people are not aware of the fact that Romanization and everything. One of the things I like to tell students is we study Confucianism today. The reason why we don't focus on the 5 classics, the 4 books, the Wu Jing Se Shu, and the Se Shu. Why we don't start with Dash, right? Why we start with Lun Yu, the Analyses? It's because the Jesuits transform, make Confucius as Kung Fu Zhe, not just Rujia, but Confucianism. That changed the nature of Confucianism. And the only reason, we talk about the Analyses, the way we talk about it today was because of the Jesuits. So like what Lionel Jensen, Manufacturing Confucianism, that book, it changes the way. So what we are aware is Christianity has transformed. So one of the latest interests is like more and more Buddhist scholars are also exploring the possibility that Avalokiteshvara between Kuan Yin, because of communication on the Silk Road between the Church of the East missionaries and the Buddhist missionaries, Theotokos influencing. So these are just examples of things that shows that why we need to focus on this, not just what the society has done for church, but what also church and Christianity has done to change culture, societies, communities beyond the church.
Thank you. So I'm really sorry, I have to keep an eye on the clock over there. And we still have about 6 minutes, and I would like to give a chance at least for 1 question or 2 from the online audience. Sorry.
Yes, there's been significant engagement from the online audience of more than 100 guests. And so I regret I won't be able to get to all of the questions, right? There is one question from Brian Go asking, could I invite the speakers to consider the sponsorship of Catholic studies? Should it be initiated and sponsored by the diocese, by a secular university, or possibly a partnership between the two? And with this secular religious debate, what are the prospects and challenges for scholars in the road ahead? And if I can just squeeze in one additional question, what does Singapore have to offer in this conversation?
Hey, hello, Brian. Brian is our former student from history, Catholic. He wrote his honors thesis on the Aogang Teochew community, and he's doing his PhD now in history of Asian Catholicism in the States. I will just introduce him. I'm not going to speak for the Catholic diocese.
Sure. So he's wondering how, whether it should be initiated and sponsored by the diocese, by a secular university, or what this might look like.
I mean, in the U.S. context, Catholic studies there's never been, none of the dioceses in the U.S. sponsor Catholic studies. So it's always been between individual Catholic donors and universities, whether Catholics or private non-Catholic universities or public non-Catholic universities. So in the case of Singapore, for example, I think the question is, there's always this attitude that things have to come from top down, but sometimes I think from the bottom up, grassroots driven. So if Catholics in Singapore give small donations to NUS or to Isaac to say endow a postdoc or endow a small research program in Catholic studies. You know, this is the model that at Chinese University of Hong Kong is again driven by on a private initiative, Hong Kong Catholic donors and CUHK, which is basically a kind of Protestant kind of university. The Catholic diocese is not really involved in that. So this is something I leave to audiences online as well as in person. You know, if this is something that is important to you, you know, that's worth studying, a small donation of $100, whatever you can give, you know, to NUS, because NUS is now accepting donations. Perhaps there's a way to get something started rather than wait from, say, from the top down, Vatican or diocese or the bishop to do something. Take the initiative and work on it.
No, I mean, local Buddhists have donated money. We have a scholarship in Buddhist studies for either master's students or PhD students doing working on Buddhist related topics. So if people were to give enough money for a donation to start a fund for let's say it would probably be specifically for people doing let's say a graduate thesis or something on a topic related to Catholicism. That's the sort of thing that the university welcomes. And if you give money, you have the right, especially if you give a larger sum of money, you have the right to designate what it's going to go for.
That's right. The Buddhists have done it. 2022, NUS announced a new Buddhist studies program. So if the Buddhists can do it, I think there are enough wealthy Catholics who can start that too.
But it'd be good if the cause for which we want donation touches people's hearts. If it's too abstract, like religious studies or spiritual studies, well, we may get a few donors, but it will not engage human beings in the mass. If you say I want to study the Teochew Aokang community, well, yeah, there are many people who are Teochews and from Aokang who will say, yes, I'm interested in that. And then be cough out a few dollars. Or if you are Buddhist and say, I want to study about the Soka Gakkai, well, you won't have problem getting money. So bring it down to a level which touches people's hearts so that the soil in which we're implanted will give us a nourishment that we want.
The problem is that if it's that specific, I'm Vice Dean of Graduate Studies. So if it's that specific, it's not easy to find people to give it to. So from that point of view, to have something broader like Catholic studies, let's say a scholarship in Catholic studies for a graduate student working on a topic related to Catholicism, or for example, to give a prize for undergraduates, because some undergraduates in various disciplines write their honors theses on topics related to local Catholicism, things like that. You could give money for a prize, money for a scholarship. That leaves a fair amount of flexibility in terms of who can win them. I think it's quite good.
Thank you. I'm very sorry, but I have to end this conversation because it's already 5:30. So, but before we end, however, I would like to once again thank you, our three very distinguished speakers, for taking the time to join us in person and sharing their analyses and insights on Catholic studies. This has been a very rich and stimulating conversation, showing the importance of the topics for 21st century Asia and the Catholic Church. So to each of you, thank you so much for making this possible.